Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce author, teacher, journalist, and radio documentarian Sandy Tolan. Sandy is an associate professor at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism at USC and has also taught at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. He is a co-founder of Homeland Productions and has produced many documentaries and features for public radio. As a journalist, Sandy has reported from all over the world, particularly from the Middle East, Latin America, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. Sandy's work has won many awards, and as well, he was a 1993 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and an I.F. Stone Fellow at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Sandy is also the author of 3 books and is here to talk to us about his newest one, Children of the Stone. In this book, Sandy tells a different kind of story about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than what we are usually fed by the news media. It's a story of how music and hope can gain a foothold in a place known by most only for its oppression, poverty, and violence. In it, we learn how a Palestinian man, Ramzi, first introduced as a boy, famously captured on film, throwing rocks at soldiers, not only transforms his own life by becoming a musician, but also spreads hope by founding music schools all over Palestine. This book is a necessary story of the power of one individual to positively impact those around him, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And here I will let Sandy take over. Won't you help me welcome him to Politics and Prose?
Thank you very much, Anne. It's great to be here at Politics and Prose, and it's great to see so many familiar faces here, some of whom I had no idea would be coming. So I'm grateful for your presence. And thanks for that introduction, sort of setting up a little bit of the story. I want to do a little bit of reading from it, talk about sort of where the story, the sort of origin story of this book, and then also talk a little bit about, since we're at Politics and Prose, talk a little bit about the politics of this issue now. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions as well. At the end, I'm going to show some pictures and leave this one up for the time being. This is Ramzi Hussein Aburedwan, when he was about 8 years old in the Al-Amari refugee camp just outside of Ramallah in probably 1987, late 87, early 1988, during the first Palestinian uprising or intifada. But how did I meet him? Well, I was in Ramallah doing research for what would become The Lemon Tree, first the radio documentary and then the book. But all around town in 1998, there were these posters. One, and the poster had 2 images. They were taped up all over Ramallah. One was an image of Ramzi, somewhat similar to this. You'll see a little later, in the act of throwing a stone, as this boy with kind of rage and fear and resolve in his eyes, throwing a stone at an unseen Israeli soldier. Part of the intifada, as I'm sure many of people here know, was an effort by the Palestinians to expel the Israeli occupation and to take steps for Palestinian freedom at the end of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. But in the same poster, next to that image was this image of an older Ramzi, 10 years later, playing the viola. And beneath it, it said, Palestine National Conservatory of Music. And in a way, it was like this advertisement for the era that still existed then, an era of hope under the Oslo Accords. The Accords had been signed 5 years earlier by Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn. And during that time, even a few years later, there was quite a bit of a sense and a hope that was shared by many Palestinians, many Israelis. It was the beginning of what a lot of people call the dialogue era of Oslo, a lot of people witnessing each other's history and dialogue groups, and this idea that there would be 2 independent sovereign states standing side by side in peace. That was what a lot of people hoped at the time. Not everybody. A lot of Palestinians still to this day want a one state for everybody living together. We can talk about those distinctions later if you're interested. But Ramzi, which, by the way, the word in Arabic, one interpretation, one translation is symbol, and he was exactly that. He was a symbol that a lot of people saw in him this possibility. I did a piece for NPR back then in '98, and found him in the refugee camp, and he said, my dream is to get really good at the viola. He had just recently started playing, and I want to go and learn and come really good at it and come back and open up music schools for the children of Palestine. And I thought, well, what a great dream. He's living in a refugee camp with his impoverished grandparents who were expelled from their village in 1948 during the creation of Israel, along with 750,000 other Palestinians, either who fled or were driven out. And there was a great deal of longing for trying to go back home, and a sense that, for someone like Ramzi, the idea that he was going to be able to sort of create a music school out of all of this seemed improbable at the time. But he did get a scholarship to study in France, and I went and visited him there once, and my brother coincidentally lives right nearby. And then I lost touch with him until about 10 years later, in December of 2009. I was in the West Bank working on a couple of stories, and I walked in with a couple of former students of mine from Berkeley, one of whom is Ben Hubbard, who, the name may sound familiar, did fantastic work from Gaza for the New York Times this past summer, and another student named Lubna Takruri, and we wandered into this place because we couldn't find this other restaurant, and we walked in, and I hear, "Sandy!" And I look, and there's Ramzi sitting across in the corner of the room. He had grown a beard, so I didn't recognize him right away. And I was kind of peering at him, and this guy beaming at me, and he said, "Ramzi." And so he comes, we greet each other in the traditional way, and smiling. I said, "So what are you doing?" He said, "Oh, well, I'm opening up music schools for the children of Palestine." And, got chills, and he came and sat, and I kept grabbing his arm saying, "Ramzi, you did exactly what you said you were going to do when you were 18 years old. And he said, "Well, why don't you come by tomorrow, and I'll show you what we've done." And so 5 years later, I'm here telling you this story. And, it is the story of a lot of hope and a lot of dreams for an entire people to create the conditions for their own freedom. And yet, at the same time, they had all, especially these kids, had gone through such a crucible of trauma. There's a phrase in Arabic, atfal al-hijra, I'm probably not pronouncing it precisely, but that means children of the stones. And these were the kids on the front lines who were, as much as anyone, helping create that atmosphere and that what ended up bringing the Israelis to the negotiating table back in the early 90s, what created the Oslo Accords, which at the time people, as I said, had a lot of hope about. But I wanted, before sort of moving forward with how Ramzi realized his dream, I want to give you a sense of how he actually lived as a child. With his grandparents, with his brother, his two little sisters. His mother had abandoned him at age 5, and he was raised by his grandparents. And it wasn't an easy life in any case, but then when the intifada started in December of 1987, things changed quickly, and the kids would daily confront the soldiers with stones. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with that basic story, but what you may not be familiar with is that they were seeing that as an exercise of trying to end the occupation and, as I said, create the conditions for their own freedom. So I'll read a little bit of what Ramzi's daily life was like. For Ramzi, at first, it was like a game. Soldiers came, he threw stones at them. They chased him, he escaped. His favorite place to begin the ritual was a yellow stucco wall at a house on the corner of Al-Amri's main road, about 150 miles from the 4-story stone building and the entrance to the camp. Across the road, he could see the white plaster minaret of the camp mosque, where 5 times a day the muezzin made the musical call to prayer. On a cold morning in early 1988, the older youths, or shabab, were smashing big rocks and curbstones into smaller pieces, good for throwing. Ramzi watched them wrap their faces in checkered keffiyehs to guard against their identities from the military surveillance crews and the informants, and to protect themselves from tear gas. Others deployed fresh-cut onions to dull the effects of the gas. Ramzi and the other boys began crumpling newspapers and stuffing them into tires, the better to get them smoking. From his pocket, Ramzi pulled out the slingshot he had made from the laces and tongue of an old shoe. He preferred this for long-distance targets. The boys rotated their arms like baseball pitchers warming up at the bullpen. This way, they wouldn't get cramps. Now, bear in mind that they were facing an army. They were facing soldiers who sometimes threw rubber coated metal bullets, shot those bullets rather, plastic bullets, and sometimes live ammunition, and often chased them, as we'll hear in a moment. Someone lit a match. From the blazing tires, twisting black columns rose above the camp, signaling the start of another day of battle. Ramzi wrapped his right hand around a jagged piece of curbstone. He glanced behind him to the long row of cement block homes, checking his escape route. On the rooftops, laundry flapped from metal wires suspended between posts. Crooked TV antennas poked toward the sky. He wore blue jeans and tennis shoes. His red jacket with the faux sheepskin collar was flying open. In his left hand, Ramzi held a rock nearly half the size of his head. His raised right arm was drawn behind him, his hand clutching the piece of curbstone. Ramzi's eyes conveyed a mixture of anger, fear, and resolve. His arched eyebrows seemed to say, "We are here." His left foot was planted, and he was stepping forward with his right. In one more second, the stone would fly. In that instant, a photojournalist snapped a picture. It captured a lone boy, one of thousands of the children of the stones, confronting an unseen army. The stone flew and the chase was on. Ramzi turned and ran hard around the corner, past the stucco wall, down the alley toward the bakery. "Stop!" a voice called in accented Arabic just behind him. Elated and terrified, Ramzi zigzagged through the camp, darting left, doubling back through a darkened passage, bursting into a neighbor's house, climbing through an upstairs window, and racing along the rooftops. Still, he hadn't shaken his pursuer, who ran along below, pointing and shouting. Ramzi felt his sneakers grabbing the dimples of the tin roof. He saw his limbs pumping in a perfect rhythm with his panting breath. In times like these, in full flight from the soldiers, a strange sense of calm often settled over him. There wasn't time to put words to a prayer, but he put out the energy of a fragmented offering. "God, I love you. I need you. I need to be alive." There was nothing more in the world that could help him. Once a bullet whizzed past, and he understood his life in terms of centimeters. Oddly, in these moments, Ramzi felt protected, buoyed, lifted, and cared for as he ran and ran, sprinting from rooftop to rooftop, leaping toward an imagined freedom. And that's what so many people were imagining in those days, with a lot of hope in those times, imagining freedom. And yet, at that time, there was already the architecture of the undermining of this so-called two-state solution. When I first came in 1995, I was amazed that I was traveling on these roads that were smooth as glass and brand new. They were in the West Bank, and they were reserved for settlers and VIPs. I qualified as a journalist. But I was amazed. I kept thinking, well, isn't this land that's supposed to be set aside for a Palestinian state? Well, if it is, why are they building these roads? And I talked to this aide to Shimon Peres, and he explained that this was good because it avoids the confrontations, but more and more and more and more of these roads. And of course, settlements began to expand, and new settlements, so-called outposts that are originally illegal, and then they become sort of legalized. There were 109,000 settlers on the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem, when the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. Today, there are about 350,000. So you can understand if a Palestinian would say, well, I don't see what this peace process has gotten us. It's created what now is and we'll talk about this more in a bit, but it's like an archipelago of islands, of small semi-sovereign islands within a sea of military control. Israel has control of about 60, direct military control of about 60% of the West Bank now, and the Palestinians live in sort of the islands amidst this. And yet, you know, there was not, this didn't mean that people stopped wanting to assert their freedom and wanting to think of a way to create, as I said, the conditions for their own independence. And in Ramzi's case, it took the form of a dream of building a music school. He went off to France, and he learned from French viola teachers how to get better at the viola. Meanwhile, he took his bouzouki with him and continued to play Arabic music, and started an Arabic band called Daluna, which still exists today. And he started thinking about ways that he could actually create this music school, which he had talked to me about back in '98 when I did this NPR piece. He could have actually created quite a good life for himself as an itinerant musician, classical musician, and Arabic musician in Europe, but he always had this idea of, like, I am going back. I want to go back. And yet, in 2000, the second intifada erupted. And he was in his second or third year by then at the Music Conservatory in Angers, France. And that, as you may recall, was a much more violent, many more casualties, and a lot of suicide bombings, a lot of Israeli incursions, the horrible events in Jenin where people were buried alive. This was the time that Ramzi's thinking about starting a music school. And some people said, Ramzi, you know, why are you even thinking about this, right? But he just did not, he never let it go. He would go, and they started touring around with his band, and they would go to concerts in Le Mans or in Paris or in other countries actually adjacent to France. And he would go on stage and he would tell the story about his time in the Intifada, and what he had this dream. And he'd say, you know, can you think about any instruments you might have at home? They shouldn't be sitting in the attic. They shouldn't be sitting in your basement. Donate them to us. He had formed this organization called the al-kamanjati Association. Al-kamanjati meaning the violinist. And so he had this idea that he would just get all these instruments donated, and sure enough, people would come to France or to his al-kamanjati center in France, and then eventually back in Ramallah, and they would bring instruments one by one, 5 by 5. Italian pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land would bring instruments with them, and he kept going around saying, "This is what I want," and yet he himself had a lot of doubt, like, you know, really, it's like in the middle of all of this, can I really do something like this? And then at the end of 2002, he came home to the refugee camp, and Ramallah was under siege. A lot of the West Bank and Gaza was under siege. And Ramzi brought his bouzouki with him and went to this child rehabilitation center where kids who are able-bodied and others who are not learned together. And he came and he played some music for them, put on a little concert, talked about music, and he noticed their artwork on the walls and on the floor they were drawing, and it was bombs going off, orange fire exploding out of tanks and mothers at checkpoints. And he thought, you know, this is, you know, when I'm in France, I go visit these schools and I see kids drawing suns and moons and sky, you know, and he thought, you know, kids draw what they know, they what they see. And so he went back home to his grandfather's and came back about a week later to give another little workshop. And all of a sudden, the kids were running up to him and not as shy as before. And he looked at them, and they were drawing musical instruments. And that's when he said, you know what, I have to come and I have to do this. Jumping forward to 2005, Ramzi's a bit of a Pied Piper. He really is a charismatic fellow, and he convinced a lot of musicians, especially his colleagues from the music school in France, to come with him and try this out for a couple of summers, 2003, 2004, 2005. And not only young musicians, but there was a fellow named Peter Solsky, who was a violist with the London Symphony Orchestra, grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he felt like he didn't have enough, he wanted more meaning in his life. And somehow he had met Ramzi because he was one of Ramzi's original viola teachers. He quit, and one of the reasons that he could do work in the Palestinian occupied territories, and he started working with Ramzi as a consultant. There was a woman in a sort of at the beginnings of her opera career in the UK who cut that short and began teaching vocal lessons. She became the vocal teacher at al-kamanjati. People started coming from all over Europe, the United States, and it was a kind of an amazing melange of people who wanted to work with Palestinian kids. And I want to talk about one of them. The first student was this girl named Ala Shalalda. She and her brother and sister and the rest of her family had been deeply traumatized during the second intifada, when Israel was basically, there was a tank right down the street. And she was very wary, but when Ramzi started bringing the musical instruments to this newly refurbished piece of property right by her house, she wasn't sure. They unloaded this truck, and it was full of musical instruments, and she recognized one as a piano only because she had seen a piano on a Tom and Jerry cartoon, but she didn't know what a violin was. But one day she wandered in the early days of al-kamanjati, when they had all the instruments. They had been shipped from France and brought in by all these different people, pilgrims and others, and they didn't really have any employees. They hadn't started teaching, and Allah basically became the first student, and she chose the violin. And Ramzi said, to learn the violin, it takes a lot of work. And she said, I don't care. I'm going to do the work. And so Allah, who is now on the cover of the book, became the first student about 10 years ago in 2005. But in the context of their lives, and I weave this into the book with some frequency, it's not just a matter of learning music. It's not just a matter of one person holding on to a dream and realizing it and becoming a hero to his people because he stuck onto this dream. That's all true. And the fact that he was 5 years old helping his grandfather sweep the streets of Ramallah, because his grandfather was a municipal garbage worker, and Ramzi insisted on helping him from age 5. All of that is true, but there's also this context of the occupation that every Palestinian child has to deal with. And every Palestinian child has not known anything else, which is the thing that still astonishes me when I think about it. The occupation is 48 years old. For people who haven't had a chance to travel out, that's all they know, right? So Allah became very dedicated to the violin. Her sister became very dedicated to the flute. And they began traveling across the West Bank to concerts. Ramzi put on a Baroque festival every December. They had summer camps. But all of that is in the context of occupied West Bank, right? Now, if you think about the West Bank, it's a little bit smaller than the state of Delaware, which I believe is our second smallest state, right? There are, on average, it varies, some 600 barriers, checkpoints, roadblocks, rammed earth barriers, surveillance towers, other physical obstacles to travel. And so the hardship for people just getting by in a day-to-day basis is significant. And I want to read a little piece of that for you tonight. And maybe if I'm skilled enough, a little multimedia. One evening, riding home from a concert in Bethlehem, Allah, Rasha, and a few of their fellow musicians suddenly came upon a military barrier erected hastily in the road. "Halt!" commanded a sign in Arabic and Hebrew. Just beyond, an olive-clad soldier was checking documents. "Flying checkpoint," Rasha said. These were temporary barriers the military erected on the fly for the stated purpose of catching suspected militants and those without proper documents who might try to evade the fixed checkpoints, also known as random or surprise checkpoints. They were so ubiquitous that Allah and Rasha were never surprised to encounter them. "It's normal," Allah said. She was 10 years old at the time. More than any single reality in Palestine, checkpoints defined life under occupation. By 2008, the number of flying checkpoints had reached 90 per week, part of the 630 closure obstacles Israel had erected across the West Bank, a territory slightly, as I said, slightly smaller than Delaware. 3/4 of the main roads leading into the West Bank's biggest cities and towns were now blocked or controlled by checkpoints. Military authorities said the strict measures were necessary to protect Israeli lives. Palestinians and humanitarian organizations saw them as a means for Israel to control the occupied population and protect the movements of settlers who had illegally seized Palestinian lands. Quote, "What was once justified by the Israeli authorities as a short-term military response to violent confrontations and attacks on Israeli civilians," declared a semi-annual UN report on the occupation, appears to be developing into a permanent system, a system which is fragmenting the West Bank territory and affecting the freedom of movement of the entire Palestinian population. Now, that was written 7 years ago, and it's certainly consistent with my observations since then. In fact, I used to play a game when I go there to see if I could go an entire minute traveling through the West Bank without seeing some evidence of the occupation and the settlements, either a settlement itself, a surveillance tower, a military base, some kind of outpost. And sometimes you go around a long curve and you couldn't see, but basically the last time I went, I just stopped playing the game because, I mean, not really a game, but I've just the test. I stopped testing myself. So that's even more so than what that UN report said. It counters that checkpoints could be deadly, but mostly for Allah and Rasha, they were humiliating, dehumanizing reminders of who had control. At the flying checkpoint, the van carrying Allah and Rasha slowed and came to a stop. The sisters gazed at the sign. Behind the soldier, a military Humvee blocked the road. The soldier beckoned the van forward. He opened the sliding door. "What's that?" the soldier asked Allah, pointing to her soft blue instrument case. "This is a violin," replied Allah, now 10 years old. The soldier told her to step out of the van. "Do you know how to play?" "Yes." "Play." "Don't play for him," Rasha yelled in Arabic. "Play," repeated the soldier. Allah frowned, looking into the van uncertainly. Muntasir, the clarinet player, said softly, "It's okay. Play, Habibti. Play, my dear." Ramzi's main purpose for founding al-kamanjati, he had said many times, was to protect the children from the soldiers. The statement often sounded like a slogan or a soundbite. But Allah, Rasha, and other children of al-kamanjati had begun to wear their music as a kind of armor, and now at the flying checkpoint, Allah calmly removed her violin, placed it under her chin, stood erect, and began to play. She had chosen El-Halwadi, or The Beautiful Girl, a song by Syed Darwish, made famous by Feiruz. Let's see if this will come over. This is Allah playing some years later. A haunting melody floated out from Allah's little violin, an oriental sound, as it was called in Israel and the West. Certain and strong, Allah's notes cut through the low rumble of idling cars and floated above the checkpoint into the night air. We saw in his eyes he was shocked, Allah remembered. It was something he didn't understand. In the melody, the sisters could recall the words about a penniless child whose mood is serene, for she has put her life in God's hands. With patience, change will come. All will be better. Rasha, staring intently from inside the van, felt a surge of pride in her little sister, playing unfazed. They claim that we are people with no identity. Hang on a second, I'm just got to now turn this off. There we go. But Allah proved them wrong, Rasha said. Music, Rasha believed, was not only a source of pride, it was a means of assertion, protection, and even, at times, vengeance. Then the moment turned. Another soldier walked over to listen. He was smiling and seemed to be enjoying the impromptu concert. "I play too," he said when Allah finished. "May I try?" Another soldier asked Amir, the guitar student, if he could borrow his instrument. The soldiers began to play, smiling at Allah and her fellow musicians, who gaped at them in astonishment. Suddenly, to Rasha, the soldiers seemed like normal people. "I do not know how they can do something like this, but at the same time treat people so badly," she said, genuinely confused. "I do not know if they have two personalities or exactly how it works." Soon the van was on its way back to Ramallah, leaving its passengers to wonder who those soldiers were and what it might be like to meet them under different circumstances. And different circumstances it could sum up the wishes and the aspirations of so many people in this whole tragedy that goes back, it depends on who you talk to, when it started. You could say that in 2017 it'll be the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which is one pretty strong touchstone of history. I want to just do a little postscript to that story. About 4 months later, Ramzi, ever the entrepreneur and wheeler dealer, managed to, and I don't mean that in a bad way, he's just very entrepreneurial. He managed to finagle some funds to send a group of the students to Italy, including Rasha and Allah. Now, like a lot of parents all over the world, Nabil, their dad, was not that excited about having a 14-year-old and a 10-year-old go unaccompanied to Italy. And he was about ready to put the kibosh on it when Ramzi said, "But Nabil," who happened coincidentally to have studied architecture in Italy, "why don't you go as a chaperone?" And so Nabil did, along with other parents, and they all went off to Italy. And I'll just read a little bit from that. Ramzi kept up with the Italy trip through emails from Nabil. The children were performing in village squares and making friends along the way. A Palestinian gelato shop owner had treated the family, refusing their money. At the Piazza della Signora in Florence, the kids gaped at marble statues from the Renaissance period, naked in struggle. In another square, Allah froze, nervous and trying not to laugh, while pigeons landed on her head and arms, and her father snapped photos. For Allah, the freedom of movement in Italy was jarring. One day, riding toward the Mediterranean coast, she asked her father, "Baba, Daddy, why aren't we being stopped?" They were in a rental car heading towards Naples. Allah was confused. Nowhere could she see checkpoints, jeeps, or Humvees. "Habibti," Nabil replied softly, "Darling, this is Italy. This is not Palestine." And it brings me back to, all of my trips there. I think I took in total 6 trips to the region for this book. And it's really the kids that kept bringing me back, their aspirations, their dreams. And at the same time, for a story like this, for a book like this, I see journalist colleagues here, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one who's asked, why should I care about this story? I ask my students that all the time. Why should I care? What's at stake here, right? So, on the one hand, you have a very compelling story of this boy who helped his grandpa sweep the streets, and then he got to learn music. The first thing that turned him on was when his grandfather found a teddy bear, in a refuse pile that happened to play notes from the Ode to Joy, and Ramzi would listen to that while his grandfather was sleeping. So at the same time, so this is an amazing story of how he created this, but what is the sort of broader meaning? I mean, what does it mean for us as citizens, as American citizens? And I want to try to make some connections here. One of the things that's most striking to me, having traveled to the region for 20 years, and especially after doing this book, is, there are torrents of press coverage. Entire forests have fallen covering this issue. And there is very, very fine coverage. And I mentioned just one. And I remember Bill Kovach, your old colleague John Kiffner, did an amazing work from the region. Ben Hubbard, Anthony Shadid with the Washington Post. I mean, these are great journalists. So I don't mean to cast aspersions on anybody, but I would also say that despite the torrents of coverage that's focused on the U.S. relationship to Israel and its relationship with the United States, especially in the last few months, the daily reality of half of the people in a century-old conflict is essentially off the radar. Now, not entirely off, because there are all these people who are doing fine work, as I just said, but we don't really think about these kids, right? We don't really think about the incredible hardship of what the occupation has done. And I've thought a lot about why is this, right? I mean, I think there's culture at work, there's politics for sure, and there's money. I was raised Catholic, but I think Jew and Gentile alike in this country were largely raised on what I call the Leon Uris Exodus version of history, which is to say the heroic birth of Israel out of the Holocaust and the Arabs, who prefer to call themselves Palestinians in this case, although of course there were other Arabs in struggle at war with Israel over the years, but their portrayal is, for example, in Exodus, is either as pathetic, malicious, or non-existent. One of the recruiting lines that when I wrote The Lemon Tree, this old Jewish guy who chose to stay in Bulgaria rather than come to Israel, as 95% of the Bulgarian Jews had done, he said, they tried to recruit us with this line, people without land go to a land without people. And of course, there were people on this land, but I think that's part of it. Part of it, the story, is our identity more with one side, and the notion that someone else has rights and history and culture and centuries of connection to a landscape is not deeply conveyed. And I think to some extent that is the basic media narrative today, that Israel, surrounded by a sea of enemies, must be secure. And of course, I know few people who would disagree with that, but it's seldom is it also then said, well, the Palestinians have the same right, and they also should have the right for freedom of movement in their own homeland. So I think there is this sort of historical portrayal of the conflict in terms of security only, and then just even in recent years, if you choose to look at some of the campaign contributions, particularly on the Republican side, you have Sheldon Adelson, who has actually advocated bombing Iran with nuclear weapons, bankrolling Republican candidates. Newt Gingrich in 2012, and I don't think he's decided who he wants to bankroll now. You look at William Kristol's Emergency Committee for Israel, and the elevation by money like that of people like Tom Cotton to prominence. I think this is further distorting the picture, and then there is the money that's connected to lobbying, and particularly the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, which has, if anybody is interested in reading an extremely well-reported expose, Connie Brook in The New Yorker back in September wrote a spectacular piece that demonstrated how deeply they influenced the debate in Congress, and that helps shape, of course, the debate in our country. And I think that all of this has basically created a ruinous effect on debate about this issue. And so almost invariably left out of discussion is the devastating effect on Palestinian lives of what's now almost a half-century long military occupation. I don't think anybody can advance a solution without understanding what the daily hardships are. It's just not practical to not take that into account. And it's also, if you really look at it and build awareness toward it, it's unacceptable. It's unsustainable. So that's what I believe. But I also want to get back to just showing you a few images and talking about them, and then opening up some conversation. There's also a lot to say about the journalism here and the reporting of it, and if anybody is interested, I'd be delighted to talk about that. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this up to the podium so I can do this more easily. So obviously this is Ramzi in 2008. If you look to the left here, that red coat with a fur collar, that's Ramzi. I got this image out of the archive of the refugee camp. There's the famous poster, somewhat adapted. It was originally for the Palestine National Conservatory of Music, and Ramzi made it his own when he opened the music school. You can see on the left is 18-year-old Ramzi, and there is 8-year-old Ramzi on the right. This is when he's trying out this music school experiment. He's playing in the refugee camp. Appears to be imploring someone to become a student, and they don't seem to all be necessarily on board yet. There's the curiosity, just the incredible curiosity, the opportunity that's created by this. An image of occupation. This is women, obviously. They are waiting to pray at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This is a woman named Jessie. She was a student with Ramzi at the Music Conservatory in Angers, France, and he recruited her because she has this beautiful operatic voice. And even though she didn't know any Arabic, her parents came from Cameroon to France, she was intrigued by what Ramzi was doing and taught herself how to sing in Arabic, even though she can't speak it. So she began singing Fayrouz, the famous Lebanese singer. And now, today, Jessie is an opera singer in Philadelphia. And I'm going to do a talk there in a couple of days, and I hope to be able to see her. This is Ramzi playing for his grandparents. This is in the refugee camp. A lot of times when people say refugee camp, you think, oh, it's like in Sudan. It's like they're all tents. That's how it started. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees were driven out or fled during the War of 48, and they did live in tents for the first couple of years. They lived overseen by the Red Cross. Then the UN stepped in 1950 and began building what they thought would be temporary shelters, but the refugees themselves just wanted to go back home. That's another very, very difficult issue, and it's one of the reasons that this tragedy between Israel and the Palestinians has not been solved. There, Ramzi, with an impromptu concert for Yasser Arafat during the Second Intifada, when the so-called Muqata of Arafat was under siege, and they managed to get in and play a concert. This is the music school. This is al-kamanjati near the opening night. There's Ramzi at the door. Who would like to say what this looks like on the ground? Looks like snow. So that big shipping container I told you about, right? That brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars, many instruments, even a harpsichord donated by a woman in France. And it was packed in big foam containers and in tires and in long strips of white paper stuffed into clear plastic bags that the adults, after they unpacked the instruments, dutifully stuffed into dumpsters. But the children had a better idea. And this was opening night of al-kamanjati in August of 2005. Another image taken by yours truly. This is what Palestinians, at least one guy named Jadi Sak that I know, who has a think tank in Bethlehem, in his dark humor calls the chicken plucking machine. For those who have permits to go to Jerusalem from Bethlehem, they will pass through this chute. And on the other side of the wall facing north towards Jerusalem is a sign was a sign last time I was there in 3 languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English, that says, "May peace be upon you." This is Ramzi with O'Day, who became this big star. He was recruited out of the refugee camp called Al-Fawar in the South Hebron Hills. Ramzi, I think, saw a lot of himself in this kid in 2004 and came back, or I can't remember, 2003, and then came back in 2004, and he had this idea. He wanted to have Ramzi wanted to have O'Day Khatib, this boy, be the new face of al-kamanjati. So, and he was this powerful kid, and his voice was great. And so they went to the mom in the camp and said, I would like to take your son to France. And his mother's like, what? Do you mean like he'll go to Paris? And she said, yes, if you give us permission. So she said, well, I have to check with my husband, but have him just sing happy songs. And then the father came and said, no, we want songs, nationalist songs. And but they did allow them to go. This is a castle called Qasr Qasim in central Palestine that was built in 1820 by for a governor of the Ottoman Empire, and 200 years later, nearly, it was filled with Palestinian kids learning Arabic music and classical music. Teachers came from all over Europe and America and Palestine. This is Celine Dagher, who was born in Lebanon from a Christian family, and had to leave with her 2 sisters. Her parents took them out during the Lebanese Civil War in 1989 when she was 8 years old. They had purposely given them French-sounding names because they knew they might have to take them out. And years later, Celine decided to come back and be a volunteer for al-kamanjati. And her mother said, what are you doing? We took you out of there, and now you're voluntarily going back? What has gotten into you? This is Sebastia, which is a town that was founded before Christ, before the Common Era. I don't remember the date. This is an old Roman amphitheater where the kids and Ramzi and O'Day and classical music, they were playing the Peer Gynt Suite the summer I was there in 2010. And there was also a couple of French beatboxing. Does anybody know what beatboxing is? Yeah. So they were doing loops on their iPhones in front of this microphone, and the older people in the village were just like, "What the heck is going on?" But the kids were just loving it. They were just thinking it was the greatest thing. And it was probably the only time that beatboxing music was played in this particular Roman amphitheater. This is on the West Bank. Israel border. These are Palestinian men waiting to be transported for legal day labor work in Israel. This photo was taken by an Irish actor who was on a delegation sponsored by the World Council of Churches. Fadi Basha, father is a biologist, PhD, got his PhD in Japan where Fadi was born. Then they moved back home to Jenin. Fadi was accidentally discovered to have this amazing voice. He was playing the violin, but then he started singing one day, and Julia, the vocals teachers, immediately started teaching him Italian arias, which he managed to sing without accent. And so much so that when he was singing one of them in Bethlehem, members of the Italian consulate rushed up to him and started talking very rapidly to him in Italian. He's like, I'm sorry, someone must translate. He's probably 11 years old in this picture. This is Julia Katarina, who from the UK, who is Fadi's vocal teacher. A triumphant moment in France when O'Day, when he arrived, was so scared he kept asking for his mom, and he refused to eat this smelly French cheese called blue cheese. He just stuck to, he wanted the labneh, which is the delicious yogurt and sort of a cheese-like yogurt, and couldn't stand that French cheese. This is Allah a few years ago. I've been telling you about her. The next member of the first violin of the Palestine National Symphony, being taught there by Benjamin Payan, who's a French-born member of a Spanish orchestra. This was the results of a fire. No one knows who set it in Jenin, where al-kamanjati had a branch. There was some speculation that people didn't want there to be boys and girls studying together, music. It's not typically, the atmosphere is not typically anti-Western or anti-music, and Ramzi thinks there may have been some petty jealousies involved rather than, sort of a fundamentalist thing. But the response on the part of the kids and the teachers was this: they went outside and played. And then they built a school that's more beautiful than the one before. And nothing has happened like that since, to my knowledge. This is Batir, one of the only places along the West Bank Israel border that does not have a wall or a fence or a border trenches. And that's one of the reasons it's so beautiful. It's he's about to conduct the Mozart Sixth Symphony, and everybody's getting ready, some teachers and students, obviously. And one of the reasons this place is still preserved is that a coalition of Israeli environmental groups, Palestinians, and even one settlement, because Batir's history of being a Roman, a city of old Roman aqueducts, if the wall goes through, then that's it. So far it's preserved, and a lot of people hope that it will always be preserved. The clarinet, one of the clarinet teachers from al-kamanjati, his best friend was killed last summer on the rooftop of a building in Ramallah during the Israeli incursion in Ramallah when they were searching for the 3 teenagers who obviously were later tragically found murdered. And this is his widow and son. This is one of the proudest members of the al-kamanjati family, Shahada, the older brother of Allah, and he has become the luthier, the violin maker and instrument repair person of al-kamanjati. There's Celine, who is now Ramzi's wife, and together with Ramzi, they run al-kamanjati. Little image of musical rapture there. Gaza funeral. 2014 in the summer. Allah, that's the cover photo. And one of the things, I have a friend who was, he's an expert in Islamic custom and religious practice, and he was talking to me about this photo. That he loves the fact that it's sort of a stereotype buster. Some people say, oh, in Islam you can't play music and it's not allowed. And, well, she's got a violin. She's got the hijab. She's got blue jeans. It's just sort of like, it's kind of mixes it up, right? Like whatever you might think, that's Allah. And my favorite thing is this beautiful expression of resolve and I would say hope, looking forward. And finally, Ramzi learned his green thumb from his grandfather, and he also has a creative way of putting an old violin case to use. So with that, I'd like to take some questions. Thank you so much. Yes, I think they want you to step up to the microphone. Yeah, or one of the two microphones. Yeah.
I want to thank you for the lemon tree, which I thought was spectacular.
Well, thank you.
And I have two questions unrelated.
Okay.
In the lemon tree, you very clearly explain that not a word that is quoted is not real, that everything you quoted is a real quote, nothing is made up. Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming you do the same thing in Children of the Stone. And I wonder how in the world you are able to get that level of detailed personal quotes. The second question is, do you know whether any of the music students, I guess particularly the older ones, have been participants in either Seeds of Peace or New Story Leadership, both of which bring Palestinian and Israeli young people together to create things like the music school? At least in the case of New Story Leadership.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I mean, first of all, I'm really happy to talk, because I haven't been talking so much. I've been traveling around different places about the journalism in this. I wrote something similar to what you said about the lemon tree, but I didn't mean to say, anyway, that every quote is exactly as it was spoken, but rather how it was recalled, right? Which is different, but in other words, I didn't make anything up, right? And on this issue, as a journalist and a teacher of journalism, I better not be, right? I know people who think it's okay to have composite characters, or think it's okay to, to sort of imagine what someone might have said or what they were thinking as they drove. I won't ever say that unless somebody told me what they were thinking, right? So that's really important, and I did apply the same standards to this book. That said, I wasn't there for a lot of this. This book starts when Ramzi was 5 in 1984. So how did I recreate? By going there 6 times, by interviewing 220 people for this book, by having several thousand pages of transcripts from dozens of hours of interviews, and by, in the back of the notes, my editor was really grumbling when I told him that my source notes were 100 pages thick, and they're like, oh, this book is going to be too big, it's going to be too heavy, it's going to be a doorstop. Can you put them online? And I thought about it. We might do that with the paperback, but I mean, the point is that on this issue especially, and as a journalist anyway, you can't just create stuff. What you can do is try to recreate, and I don't mean recreation in the sort of negative sense that is sometimes used. Like you want to report the heck out of something, and so for example, when Ramzi, there's another instance when Ramzi was stopped at a checkpoint. I happened to be there, so I can report it. That's my observation. But in a case where I wasn't there, I want to interview like the opening of the music school, for example, it ends one of the sections in the book. I wasn't there. It was 2005. I didn't even know Ramzi had come back. I had no idea, right? But there were, 100 people there probably. So I interviewed maybe 20 or 30 of them, right? I'll never get to the level of Catherine Boo, who, as you may have read in Behind the Beautiful Forevers, there was a question about whether this woman had been murdered by one of the protagonists. She said, according to 178 people I have interviewed, I think it was 170. I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't get that detail. But the idea is to create narrative, to create a compelling narrative but also have it be entirely factual, it creates. You need to just really do the work and get the detail, and so that's one of the reasons why I thought this relatively shorter process of a 2-year book turned into a 5-year book. Your other question: do I know if they've worked with Seeds of Peace or New Story Leadership? I don't. I will say this though: one of the things that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years in particular is, as the growth of the settlements and the increasing restrictions on Palestinian movement have intensified, people have become very disillusioned with the so-called peace process, because they're like, well, what peace are we talking about here? And at the same time, then, there's been the rise of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which many people are very turned off by here, that the BDS movement has really taken hold in the West Bank in recent years. And people, one of the Presbyterian Church voted to divest from several companies, including Caterpillar, and there was a lot of alarm. Why are you doing this? Well, Caterpillar's D9 bulldozer has been the central instrument in knocking over tens of thousands of Palestinian homes and hundreds of thousands of olive trees. So, I mean, it's not as though there's no reason behind it. And what's happened now is that there's been a shift from the dialogue era to a much more nonviolent, and we're not talking about Hamas right now, but a nonviolent direct confrontation of Israel. And that's become this new strategy. So one of the things that was really kind of heart-wrenching for Ramzi is he was really a beneficiary of this old regime, if you want to say, or the old era of Oslo. He went and studied in Apple Hill, New Hampshire, under a program called Playing for Peace. And about a year or so ago, reluctantly, he wrote to his old viola teacher and said, we can't participate in this anymore because it's creating an illusion that everything is okay on the ground. And if you didn't call it Playing for Peace, I would still send my kids there. But so there's this sense of like a lot of people feel that we can no longer participate if it's creating the sense that everything's okay. And Ramzi also has had quite a long relationship, which I haven't talked about tonight, with Daniel Barenboim. I'm sure a lot of you know who he is. A great musician and really has been a champion of Palestinian rights, one of the most courageous people in terms of Israeli society to speak out in defense of Palestinian rights. And with the late intellectual Edward Said, the Palestinian literary critic and professor at Columbia and defender of Palestinian rights, they formed the West Eastern Divan Orchestra together out of this intellectual ferment and really love for each other, as what Daniel Barenboim, when I interviewed him, called. He said we were intellectual soulmates. They met by chance at the Hyde Park Hotel check-in desk, and Daniel Barenboim told me that since that day, he spoke to Edward Said every day for the rest of Edward's life until he died in 2003. And they started this orchestra together, and Ramzi was part of this orchestra, but those same issues of what is represented on stage as harmony when there's this increasing tightening occupation going on, it created a tension that's very palpable today. So that's a long answer to your questions. Yes, sir.
You were really just starting to lead into this on the political side, and I'm quite a newcomer to this whole thing, other than as of a year ago, March.
Okay.
Since then, I've made 3 trips.
Oh, you have? Well, you're not such a
USA.
newcomer then.
Right. Well, it's been kind of in a condensed version here. Still, the solutions I came and began to think about, but I'm starting to see some of the issues. And this last time, which was just in March, speaking to a number of Palestinians, and a couple of, I'd like to get your observations on the, what I'm hearing, they refer to it as the U.S.-Israeli occupation.
The U.S.-Israeli occupation.
Because they're saying, well, obviously without the U.S., it's...
Yeah.
they couldn't do it.
Well,
That's one thing. And the other,
Okay.
and then, this might be kind of a together thing, that what I kept hearing more and more, especially lately, and you were talking about this, although you didn't use the term, this normalization, which is, and I say, well, how does this work? And they say, well, then it maybe evolves into, and they said accommodation or cooperation or even collaboration, which is, I think, what you're talking about.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
difficult, but I'd like to hear your
Yeah, so let
comments.
me tackle that first because it sort of comes out of your question, and I it's a very complicated thing because you have a lot of people of great goodwill who want to do something, right? And now there's this new kind of emerging strategy on the Palestinian side, like we don't want this kind of dialogue. We don't want to say, let's just witness each other's history and hold hands. Like this has not gotten us our freedom. So there's a shifted strategy as I've described. And yet there are so many people in the United States and elsewhere who would like to do something to help. And at almost every one of these events that I've been doing and traveling around, people say, well, then what should I do? I mean, I think one thing is awareness of knowing what's happening on the ground and getting involved. There's a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. In fact, one of them is here tonight, Shelley Fudge. You could talk to her. There's a group called it's the American Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. Is that the U.S. campaign? Sorry, to end the Israeli occupation. So there are that's sort of where one could go more. But the question of normalization is a word that people use to describe what I was talking about in terms of Ramzi. To get your other question, the U.S.-Israeli occupation, I could see where somebody would say that it's U.S. financed in terms of, not entirely, but we as taxpayers are supporting $3 billion a year. I think one of the things that I would most fault American administrations, Democrat and Republican, for, just before Oslo, I just looked it up before we came over here tonight. Just before Oslo, Oslo began in 1993. And it's been since then that an American president or Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or anybody has said, if you don't stop building settlements, we're going to stop financing. The last person to do that was James Baker in 1992. And it was a year and a half before Oslo. So to me, the U.S. is complicit in the disastrous reality on the ground. Because if, what happened when James Baker said, well, it's up to Mr. Shamir. He can continue building, but then he won't get this $10 billion in loan guarantees. Like the settlements stopped. And I think, when you have a client state, Israel is a client state of the United States. I mean, it's obviously a close ally, but it's to not exert more pressure, I think has been a failure of leadership that just helped create the reality on the ground. So if people are saying that, it's because they see the U.S. and Israel as hand in hand. And even though the United States describes itself as an honest broker, I think that's really not a fair assessment of how it's been. One of the people that I admire who has been in the U.S. government on and off is now, I believe, still at the Middle East desk at the National Security Council, Robert Malley. He wrote some great pieces for the New York Review of Books after basically Arafat got blamed in most of the Western, at least the American press, it was his fault. He didn't accept this generous offer at Camp David in 2000. I wrote about this a lot in the Lemon Tree as well. But a lot of what I wrote, or some of it anyway, was reliant on Malley's account, who was there at the time. And Malley was very clear. He sort of kind of reassessed. So, there are people in the administration who want to take a different path, and right now there's so much distraction, if you want to call it that. I mean, the attention is on Iran, not to mention all the other things that are happening, and so what's going on in Palestine is definitely taking a back seat. But yes, sir.
I'm sorry, just we're running a little low on time, so if it's okay, this will be our last.
Okay, good.
Okay, just to share something for clarification, there's a flyer talking about an upcoming tour. It's the Children of the Stone Dalauna Ensemble Tour. And just to give a little background, the song Ala Dalauna is a very, very famous wedding debke song. It is a required wedding debke song, goes back 100 years. It has the same importance as you'd find with Siman Tov Mazel Tov at Jewish weddings. It has to be there. But what's special about the word Dalauna, it means help us, but it also evokes hope, it evokes good wishes for weddings. So I think that's a great name for the ensemble. My actual question, there is in the...
You can take these flyers, and I'm actually part of this effort to bring Ramzi in the summer and maybe next spring. So please, if you're at all curious, my colleagues Catherine and Busy, old family friend, would be happy to talk to you about it.
There's a big musical program at the Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem called Ar-Rawad, and that's head by Abdel Fattah Abu Surur. And it would be, I know that there are a number of other musical efforts at various refugee camps. Balata in Nablus is just another example. Does this group try to work with the refugee camps specifically? Yes.
I mean, that was one of the motivations for Ramzi, who grew up, as you know, in a refugee camp, and who recruited O'Day out of a refugee camp, and he's a big character in the book, by the way. And a lot of their work is in the center, al-kamanjati, but they go out. The teachers go out in vans to the camps, to villages. They've established refugee camp presence in 2 refugee camps in Lebanon as well. So that's definitely sort of at the center of the mission. Okay.
Just acknowledge Reverend Timothy Tetch.
Oh.
Piece of music about Ramzi's life, also called The Imaginary City, which is mirrored at Westmoreland congregation in the UC.
And it's great that you're here, Tim, and that was an amazing concert back in December. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's really a delight to be here with you. Thanks.